Hello, good afternoon or good evening, depending where you're joining us, or even good morning. I'm Daniel Armanios. I'm the BT professor and chair of major program management here at the Said Business School. And I'm pleased to moderate this next installment of the Oxford Smart Space series, admirably led by one of my colleagues, Mark Ventresca, and his colleagues. And this installment of the session is entitled Global Space Economy, the Next Frontier. I'm really pleased to be joined today by Ben Lawson, an associate professor of operations management here at Said Business School, and Pippa Malmgren, an independent expert and scholar of geopolitics, technology, and space. Before I ask each to introduce themselves and provide their initial foray on the topic, I'd like to set the scene a bit with the following points, mainly from my perspective, which comes out of major programs. There's a couple of general points. The first is the bifurcation of the frontier. So numerous government agencies are now focused on expanding the frontier through lunar and Martian missions and beyond, as well as satellite missions exploring the outer rim and beyond of our solar system. At the same time, government agencies, but fast increasingly private corporations, are also mining the frontier, namely around low Earth orbit operations. This is generating an extremely rich institutional, organizational, and operational landscape that even just a decade or even a few years ago were unthinkable. And each of those are replete with some interesting novel challenges and perspectives that I'm sure we'll enter into today. The second is an interesting one that I think we see a lot in supply chains and operations and beyond, and what I call the proximity connectedness gap. As we think of the space economy, we are asked to rethink important emerging debates on proximity, simply being next to someone in space, or connectedness, actually directly transferring or changing or sharing information and resources. Especially with supply chains, there is sometimes this misguided tacit view that being next to someone spatially means I'll get something faster. And yet space really challenges that. For some, sharing information or even a digital good may happen with an immediate neighbor via a satellite much quicker than actually finding them on the road next to you. And that could happen whether you're in a street in Chicago or Leeds or a village outside of Kigali or Jakarta. Therefore, how we understand supply chains fundamentally, along such tenets and others, becomes fundamentally different when we take large initiatives in the air, in outer space, versus even on the ground. And then the third point is around common goods and common costs. In work in space, the low Earth orbit is replete with new possibilities and opportunities, but also relics of past experimentation. A key challenge will be, how do we collectively traffic what's in operation for what's no longer even fit for orbit or purpose? Will the collective scheme be a robust institutional international regime, kind of similar to the Montreal Protocol around ozone that led to the repair of our ozone? Or will it lead to fights heating up over the melting of the Arctic and the minerals now available underneath, or even the neglect of collective trash and waste in our ocean? We've seen games work well and not work well. In space economy is another one where that's going to play out. And then the final point I'll make is, looking more generally from a major programs lens, this fast progression in space is reflective of a larger trend of larger scale initiatives being delivered not just as projects, but as programs. And when I think of programs, I think of portfolios of distributed projects across space with different life cycles and even different social and institutional norms. How satellites will be run is very different than how you would operate a space capsule that's going to stay in orbit. How governments run them are extremely different than how firms will run them. In studying space, we can also address another frontier, one around how we manage our large-scale initiatives around grand challenges on the ground as well. If we can establish workable frameworks for outer space, perhaps we can also advance our ability to get large-scale initiatives done on land and in sea as well. And so with that, I would like to ask each of my fellow interlocutors to introduce themselves and mention a bit about their background and expertise, and tell us what has gotten you excited about the space economy and what are the frontiers for you. And I will start with Pippa, if that's okay, and then we go with Ben.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm an economist. I was the president's economic advisor in the White House under President George W. Bush. But I've been very interested in technological innovation and being part of building the world economy and not just talking about it, as most economists do. And I got into the realm of robotics and realized that robotics are how space is going to be built out, as it were. This is about remote control, automation, robotics, and artificial intelligence. It's a whole new economy that's being created, and I'm been extremely interested in working with both policymakers who are trying to set the framework for how is this thing built, both from a strategic security and a world economy perspective, but also businesses that are being created. You know, NASA has already commissioned the first oxygen grid on the moon, the first electricity grid. Like, we are at a once in a species moment where humanity is not going back to the moon to step on it, but to stay and to build and to launch from there. And I just think this is such an extraordinary moment in history to be engaged with this subject.
Great. Thanks, Pippa, and great to see everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight talking about supply chains in the space economy. I've always been interested in aircraft and space growing up. Here, the classic pictures on the wall and toys and so forth, and dreamt of being a pilot. Real life got in the way, so to speak. And so for the last 2 decades, my academic career has really been focused on understanding supply chains in all sorts of manufacturing contexts. How do we think about global sourcing, supply chain design, managing suppliers? How do we trade off risk versus resilience, sourcing of innovation? All the things that we've been talking about over the last few years since COVID, of just how central supply chains are to the fabric of our everyday life. So it was actually when I moved to Oxford last year and was exposed to the space cluster and all the activity that's going on within the university and around Oxfordshire, that I discovered happily that there was an overlap between my research in supply chains and logistics and the space economy. And I've spent the last year really exploring the intersection of those two activities. And it's really been fascinating to see just how central supply chains are to how we think about human activity in space and in the future of in-space supply chains. So understanding this new industry with immense potential, I've found really fascinating.
Thank you, Ben and Pippa, for that start. And just to build off some points I thought was quite interesting, and it leads actually to our next question. I think one point you brought up, Pippa, this almost like transparency and anonymity gap, because a lot of security and defense technologies in space, you don't necessarily want to be known that you're a satellite observing things, but you also have to kind of let your coordinates be known. Otherwise, things will hit you all over the place. So it's kind of an interesting transparent anonymity gap. And then I think, Ben, something you said was quite profound. And, you talked about this being like almost reliving your childhood imagination to bring back your own work today. And how do we globally source for our imagination? Really here, we're trying to push what's conceivable science, what's ever been done before, which I think leads naturally to the kind of first question. We have a lot of different angles on how we're going to unpack space and economy. So maybe we should begin by unpacking these terms. So, when we think of space, we think out there and the mysterious unknown, if you will. Is that the right narrative we should take, especially given your answers? Or is there another narrative that you think is more apropos and more appropriate now that we're at this kind of stage in the frontier, if you will?
Pippa, did you want to go first?
You want me to? Sure. Look, first of all, I find most people, when you start to talk about space, their immediate reaction is, this has nothing to do with me or my business or my life. And so we have to begin with, it has everything to do with your life and your business and the world economy. And let me just outline quickly the reasons why. We are going back into space after 50 years because we think we can access unlimited energy from space-based solar power, something that both Airbus and Caltech have now proven works, and the prototypes are now being built. So just imagine a clean, green, and increasingly inexpensive source of energy that can put power in any electricity grid anywhere in the world at any time. Now, it'll take a few years to get up to a commercial environment where that's happening with reliability, but the Saudis are already investing in this. So they think oil and gas won't be as needed and won't be as valuable. So that's number one. Number two, we're going into space because we think we'll have access to virtually unlimited world-class internet to envelop not just Earth, but Earth and the lunar surface, which means the value of every square inch on Earth will go up, because you'll be able to work from anywhere and you'll be able to track assets from anywhere, and you'll be able to understand what is happening to Earth as a whole with much greater precision. Then we're also going up because of unlimited resources. So space-based mining sounds very science fiction and a long way away, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's like literally 5 to 10 years. NASA has just brought back the first samples from an asteroid called Bennu, which is like 250 million miles away. They've opened the canister, excellent samples. This is the beginning of being able to harvest everything we need to make an MRI scanner or an iPhone or a fighter jet without needing to dig Earth up anymore. Now that is a revolution in and of itself. That leads to space-based manufacturing, refining in orbit, doing all kinds of things, including the production of silicon chips, computer chips, fiber optic cables. Already the first space factory has gone up. It's manufacturing pharmaceuticals. Being in zero gravity is basically the most incredible physics lab humanity has ever had access to, and we should think of it that way. Now, on top of all that, and I'll finish with this, space is the new commanding heights from a strategic security perspective. And the Pentagon has just said this in the last literally 10 days, that space is the most essential warfighting domain now. And we can see in the war in Ukraine, that is a war that's fundamentally being conducted via satellites. And so this whole business of radically transforming Earth's economy, but also the conduct of strategic security from space. So bottom line is, space is a whole new supply chain for everything on Earth. Everything we need for daily life, all the way to everything we need for strategic security. And I think that's the way to think about it.
Thank you, Pippa. It's fascinating. So my perspective, I guess, is more around the role of space, or at least in respect of the question that Daniel asked of, is it new? Is it out there? Is it the mysterious unknown? And actually, everything that we're doing in space at the moment is coming from entirely Earth-based or terrestrial supply chains. So you might almost think of it as space 1.0, that we're building out this space supply chain infrastructure that we're going to need to do all these things in the future. And what do I mean by supply chains? Essentially, we're thinking here about the infrastructure that enables us to move material, information, services, and to make them flow through the space system, right, for operability and to offer all these amazing services. And in a way, we've been doing this for the last 20 years, right? We have mastered delivering to remote locations on Earth. In space, it's more remote, more hostile, but everything that you need has to be brought from Earth. So for the last 20 years, we've delivered supplies with the space shuttle, with Soyuz, with SpaceX, all the material, the food, the air, the materials for experiments, for research, the equipment that we need to live and work. So many of the challenges that we have for the space economy, they're known when we think about mature industrial supply chains as well. So I think maybe just to set the scene a little bit of what are some of the challenges that we're seeing in space supply chains, because there are so many challenges that are similar to mature industrial supply chains. So if we think about the operational front, for one, cost, quality, how do we find new suppliers? How do we manage export controls? More perhaps mundane processes around inventory optimization, inventory control, manufacturing processes, tensions between speed versus security, for example. Or one example that I really like around logistics and what we call less than truckload on Earth, or lighter than load for space, around how do we utilize the space inside the rockets. So the Falcon rockets is basically like a ride share. So you have Starlink taking up some of the space, but where there's excess space, SpaceX allow companies to piggyback and fill the available space. So we're able to send small satellites into space at a more marginal rate. So operationally, these are challenges that we know a lot about already. Secondly, on a supplier management perspective, we have, as we'd expect from a fairly nascent industry, we have a very fragmented supply base, many small suppliers, poor visibility over the supply base, particularly as we move into the sub-tiers. So we have a very complex environment, lots of new players in the space economy as private equity and new companies have come in. So we always have this web of vulnerabilities in hardware, in software. We're going from national programs to a global network. We have physical and digital challenges, but also the geopolitical layer as well. So third, in terms of some of the challenges we can think about in terms of geopolitics. So with the war in Ukraine and Russia, we've lost much of the capacity of the Antonov planes, the Ukrainian Antonov planes that used to be used to move the big geo satellites around Earth. So the geo satellites, these are the ones that are parked up 22,000 miles up in a geostationary orbit. We expect them to last for 15 to 20 years. And we've lost one logistics node or mode. And so we're looking at other alternatives for transportation. So for example, NASA has a Pegasus barge that they use for moving the space launch system that they're developing for deep space missions, and also other land modalities. So this is adding delays and additional complexity. And then on the price and availability front, we have commodities like xenon and krypton gas that a few years ago were 10 times the price pre-2022. Now come down, but still roughly quadruple what they were 4 years ago. So all sorts of challenges for making or for building out this space infrastructure that we still need to address and deal with.
So I love the kind of juxtaposition and tension between what you're saying, Pippa and Ben, because on one hand, Pippa, you're mentioning the boundlessness of space, the unlimited observation, unlimited resolution with data that's possible, unlimited mining of technology, unlimited energy, unlimited experimentation and testing, and also its criticality in terms of the next frontier for warfare. And what was interesting hearing that juxtaposition with Ben, it was that it's also remarkably, the sourcing of it is incredibly grounded in the sense of we have a lot of things that have to come from terrestrial technologies. We've dealt with last mile before. It's a more extreme version, but we've had those places where we've had to go to remote areas. The cost, quality, kind of export control fronts for it is different, but also has been done before. The notion that you can piggyback some forms of supply chain infrastructure to add in other stuff. The notion that it's fragmented, which you see in a lot of innovation supply chains, whether it's nuclear energy, fusion, big science, those kind of things where you need customized parts only a few can deliver. And then you kind of, towards the end, ended on the same kind of point Pippa was mentioning, which was the geopolitics. And and then you brought up commodities like rare, in this case, kind of noble gases, xenon, krypton, etc. But you can see the same thing with the critical metals. And so you can see the touch with mining, right? If most of the supply chain for rare earth metals, which we'll need for space technology, for a lot of other technologies, the landscape is heavily dominated by the Chinese, by the Russians in terms of the ownership of rare earth metals. Now, if you can mine in the meteors to get that, can that change the geopolitics? And to me, all of that together suggests there's new ways of transaction, new ways of connectedness, which then leads to the second term. So we talked about space. Now we're talking about the economy. And it seems like now when we're thinking of the economy, we're thinking of the systems of transactions, the relationships, the norms, the values to do that, whether it's an exploration and how to build the frontier of space or how to source it, you're still dealing with a web of transactions, societal norms, and the like. And so, from that, does space present any wrinkles in that thinking? And what does that mean for how we understand and potentially have to rethink the basic fundamentals as to how markets and even economic systems operates, whether it's from the Earth-based lens we have for sourcing or the kind of frontier out in space of experimentation? Does that make us rethink our connections, our transactions, even the social norms that have to govern it? Maybe Pippa again, Ben, and then we'll keep going.
Absolutely. I think this is such a profoundly important question because we're so accustomed in the course of human history to constantly having to manage scarcity. And what space potentially represents is such abundance that it has the potential to completely radically change how we think about things. So, for example, I talked about the asteroid Bennu, but there's another asteroid called Psyche, and NASA, the Jet Propulsion Lab, have a Psyche mission underway right now. It is said that Psyche is worth $10 quintillion, which no one can even process. But put a different way, if you were to distribute the value of all the gold, the iron ore, the lithium, the cobalt, all of the things that are on that asteroid, every human being on Earth would be a billionaire. Now, if that's true, the value of cobalt, lithium, gold, and iron ore is going to totally collapse because it will be ubiquitous and abundant. And while that may produce some wonderful outcomes, that it will also produce some really radical change. And I think when we talk about the geopolitics of space, we shouldn't dance around a very fundamental issue, which is the superpowers are racing for control of the commanding heights. We have a proper old-fashioned space race underway today, and everyone is trying to get their foothold on the moon. And this raises a very profound question that NASA's been asking, and I'm part of a little working group that got put together as a result of this, which it's a simple question. Should the first human institution that is not on Earth, that is on another celestial body, be A, military base, B, a mining company, or C, something else? And the group I'm working with, we're trying to create something where we lead with art, because that's humanity's universal language, and putting digital art on the moon and sending the things that represent humanity, like DNA, for example. It may sound a little corny, but it raises this profound question. Given there is abundance in space, and given that whichever superpower gets to it first is going to be so far ahead of everyone else, there may be no catch up. What is the right thing for humanity to do? And I personally have argued that actually, whichever nation does get there first should think about the Marshall Plan and think about this idea that you're going to have to share these extraordinary abundant resources with all of humanity, rather than taking kind of the J.R.R. Tolkien Gollum approach, which is, I got there first, it's mine, all mine, nobody else's, which is almost guaranteed to give us conflict. And this idea of generosity against a backdrop of true abundance that could totally transform the Earth economy and lift every single human out of poverty. These are very profound philosophical questions that are at the core of geopolitics today. I'll finish just by saying one last thing, which is there is also this awful, awful question over us all, which is, are we already at war in space? Is there already conflict? And there are signs that this is so. We're seeing a few years ago, the Russians destroying their own satellite in order to create a debris field it's a kind of denial of access strategy to prevent others from achieving operations in certain orbits. Or China and the US have satellites with robotic arms, which they both know can go up to the other side's satellite, grab it, and hurl it into outer space, rendering it completely useless. These things are already happening. And I think it's very important for everyone, whether they're involved in space or not, to start thinking about how should humanity handle this potential access to ubiquity and abundance, and do it without having a fight.
Thank you, Pippa. So again, I'll speak to the role of supply chains in this future. The way we think about building out a supply chain infrastructure will be what underpins all of this activity in space. So for me, I think the interesting changes, some things won't change, and lots of things will have to change. So firstly, we're already doing a great job of sustaining life in low Earth orbit, 250 miles from the Earth's surface. But as Pippa's talking about, things like pushing us into lunar orbit and being back on the moon. So programs like Artemis and the NASA Gateway are all about enabling us to push that out further, push supply chains out further, and that becomes a different ballgame. I think some things won't change. So, for example, part of making this a success will be making space boring, making it routine to be having weekly launches to take payloads into space, where we normalize space launch, where we have a regular cadence. And I read recently an interesting thought of, well, will we see players in freight and transportation having a logo on the side of spaceships? Will we see spaceships with Maersk and DHL and FedEx on the side? Because they know all about moving things from London to Oxford. But Oxford isn't moving. Moving things from Earth to Moon is more complicated. But as we move to deeper exploration of space, then it becomes a much more complicated story, right? How do we move freight from Earth to the Moon and then to Mars or elsewhere? It's a much more complicated story. So part of making this happen will be supply chains just getting even better and more robust in space. But the second part of that story is we're going to also need an entirely new logistics paradigm. The story that I've talked about so far is essentially terrestrial supply chains supporting space activity. But to make the future space exploration a success for near Earth orbits, Moon, Mars, our approach where we've had purely carry the cargo up with the rocket or resupply from the ISS is not going to work to support what we need to do. So we're going to be thinking about different strategies, supply chain strategies. So things like what we call in situ resource utilization. So this might be on the Moon, for example, of being able to use the resource at that location to use the water for propellant and life support and gas. How can we think about pre-positioning? So having essentially a propellant depot in space, or if you like, a gas station in orbit. So propellant being the largest mass fraction for rockets, in order to, I guess once we can start to do that, fuel and power is critical on Earth. It will be in orbit. If we can refuel in space, then we can take more cargo, we can take more people, and that refueling technology also makes the satellite industry more sustainable and profitable, right? So we're able to extend the useful life of satellites. So we have a company in Oxford called Astroscale that is trying to do exactly that, of if we can put that infrastructure in space and then we're able to refuel and service satellites, then that will be a new way of building out the supply chains. So I think that's the other last point that I would finish on as well is building out the infrastructure is also around information. So telecommunications infrastructure. It's in low Earth orbit. It's quick, as we know, but we're going to need more robust communication networks to coordinate all this activity, particularly as we move to the Moon, which has a lag, and Mars that obviously has a much longer lag. So that's how we're going to unlock from a supply chain infrastructure perspective. That's how we'll unlock this value of bringing space back down to Earth.
No, that's perfect, Ben and Pippa, on this second point, and we're already getting some wonderful questions from the audience. We'll start, and actually, the first one is a perfect juxtaposition because I see again the notion of economy of abundance, reshifting how we think through that in terms of and even the regime to think about it. Is it a Marshall Plan kind of sharing economy, or is it a Golem, my precious kind of economy, which is just myself and no others? And I think, and again, it juxtaposed with, again, this will still rely, at least in the interim, a terrestrial model. And how do we jump it up? Is it now have to be rethink? Do we need like way stations? Do we take the ideas of fueling by air in terms of, do we fuel by orbit, for example? How do we kind of do those kind of processes to change the paradigm? And that tension comes out in our first question that comes from David out of Berlin, which is arguing, okay, if we want to discuss issues of going to the moon and the like, how can we do that if we're still having trouble with our ground game, if you will? So the question in particular is, ground government and businesses handle moon settlements. How can they do that if Earth projects like the Berlin airport often fail? And this is a continuous paradigm that our big scale projects on the ground don't do so well. How is that not going to be? How is it going to be avoided when we go in space? Is it a new opportunity to do it? How do we deal with that ground and space kind of interlinkage? And whoever, Ben or Pippa, whoever wants to go first.
You want to go, Ben?
Well, I guess maybe just a quick comment of one of the things that fascinated me about this space, right? We have amazing technical skills and technologies that we're developing for space. And the challenge is, how do we bring, in a sense, the commercial discipline, and I guess I'm speaking more from the commercial supply chain point of view, that commercial discipline being brought in is one of the things that has unlocked space that we're seeing at the moment. The Falcon rockets of lowering the cost of access to orbit, where if we think about satellite technologies, that years ago it was CubeSats that were limiting you to 3 or 4 kilograms of size. But now that the infrastructure is there to support lower cost to orbit, then we're able to move to small satellites with more cargo and the ability to do more things. But back to the question. So we have the technological skills, but if supply chain is an analogy here, it's bringing the commercial discipline and public-private partnerships is going to be key to unlocking this. But David's absolutely right. This is a much more challenging environment than we already face on Earth.
Yes, that's just putting it mildly. We have to remember too, we don't have a legal framework for space that's really reliable. There's some, but frankly, the superpowers are quite literally discussing being on the brink of conflict here on Earth. I mean, in the last month, we've had senior commanders from NATO, from Britain, the chief of the defense forces, from the Belgians, from the Dutch, a constant messaging of, we need to prepare for the kind of conflict that Ukraine has been experiencing. Now, that sounds very dramatic, but it is dramatic when you start to hear NATO commanders say, there's a real risk that we end up in direct conflict, either with Russia or with China, probably over Taiwan, or both at the same time. Now, how are you going to possibly manage space if you're in conflict on Earth? And can you be not in conflict on Earth, but in conflict in space, which I think is the situation we've maybe had for some years now. And so, again, it comes down to, we're currently all operating, including private enterprise, on the I get there first, it's mine. But how is this actually going to work? And I think this is part of the reason the U.S. Coast Guard and Space Force are now working together to think about, how do you create the equivalent of what the Navy does, which is to protect shipping on the high seas, something which, again, is a hugely topical issue given the blockage in the Red Sea and the fact that ships are having to go far around the world in order to avoid basically what is a miniature naval blockade. And so the same question is in space, because space is a kind of naval environment in the sense that it's like an open ocean, a very difficult open ocean because of the magnitude and sheer size. So pinpointing, identifying locations is super hard, right? This is not an easy thing to do. So I think there's a real need to have some conversation. I just don't know, how do you do it when we're already in such a confrontational frame of mind here on Earth? I know that's not a very sort of upbeat thing to talk about, but I don't see how we can avoid this conversation. On the other side, by the way, to be clear, just to follow on what Ben was saying, this idea that we will be manufacturing, refining, conducting operations remotely in space is absolutely underway. I want the listeners to think about self-assembling, self-replicating robotics that can do things like build bricks using moon dust. And suddenly you can be within days of having physical constructs that are not on Earth, or being able, again, to do mining operations on asteroids that are, literally millions of miles away, refine it in space and bring back the materials. So again, earlier you talked about rare earth metals. I think as we go into space, we're going to have to change the name. And what we're going to have is ubiquitous space metals, right? We're going to have access to all of the things we currently call rare earths in its most highly refined state as well. Because right now, the reason the Chinese have a lock on all that stuff is not because they're the only place that has them in the ground. It's because they're the only place that will refine them into usable material. Refining processes are very toxic and no one else wanted them, and China doesn't much want them either. But if we can do it in space, then suddenly you can have access to potentially unlimited rare earths. And with that, I'll just throw one more thing into the mix, which is environmental concerns. And I do ask myself the question, even though I'm a huge proponent of the development of space, I also think we need to do it with some care. And the question is, okay, let's take asteroid mining. Could it be that asteroids are the coral reefs of space? I mean, do we just go to the moon and take a pickaxe to this thing and think about what the potential consequences are later? Or, do we start to think now about what happens as we hack into these bodies that we're not that familiar with, that may be rich in assets, but what will be the consequences? And how do we think through the possible adverse consequences of our actions? Certainly, we should be intelligent enough by now to think about these questions before we start hacking into things.
Now, this is a really rich set of answers, and I think, in some sense, you both highlight in the beginning kind of some age-old problems that, irrespective of being in space or Earth, are going to be issues, such as how do you coordinate handoffs, how do you do the logistics, all the way to, is it the governance regime that we use, right? And at the same time, you brought up some potentially interesting insights. One thing you mentioned, Ben, you were saying we need to make space boring. Perhaps if we make space boring, we can make Earth boring too, at least logistically, right? Because what's interesting, if we take Pippa's point about ubiquitous space metals, well, if now I don't have to rely on a set of really concentrated suppliers to get certain critical metals, and now I can get it from space by making space boring, perhaps we can even make Earth boring in some sense and maybe even help improve our time. And you brought up a point at the end that was nicely touched by one of the LinkedIn users, which was asking about how do you avoid the equivalent of an oil spill in space, because we don't, we're thinking about all its abundance and resource and great things, but we don't know what's going to happen if we start pickaxing at scale to something. What would happen? Does it have some, we don't know how we have a lot of unknowns about how would the lunar landscape respond to that. Is it kind of a similar biome like you would think of the Earth and the like? Which I think leads on to the second question that came up, which try to think of one perspective that's often commonly used. And I think you touched on this, Pippa, with your point on the Navy, which is kind of, you have some sovereign waters, but at some point you're navigating international waters, right? You're navigating commons, as we often like to call that, whether it's protecting estuaries that we all use, the Arctic, is that a common right now, et cetera. And I'm wondering, I think what Diana's wondering from Columbia is, what can we learn from the governance of the commons on Earth for the use of resources in space? Is it going to be a conflictual, a transactional approach? Is it going to be a relational, collaborative approach? I mean, how do you think that's going to play out, both in the the examples that you both are familiar with that are successful, and the ones that haven't been as such? Perhaps Pippa, this one seems like a good one for you to start, and then Ben, if you don't mind.
Sure. So here's an example of the problem about treating this as an interplanetary commons, let's call it that, not just a global commons. Now we're talking about interplanetary commons. Well, about 50 days before the Russian tanks went into Ukraine, someone cut what is the fastest internet connection in the world, which is on a tiny little island inside the Arctic Circle called Svalbard. Now, why do they have it there? What the heck? It's a bunch of polar bears, right? And the answer is because virtually every high altitude satellite connects to Earth at Svalbard. And the purpose of cutting that cable, and whoever cut it, they took away about 6 kilometers, right? They cut it in 2 places so nobody could say, oh, it just hit a rock. It was designed to cut off the access to those satellites. Luckily, there was redundancy, and so the cable cut didn't impact. But had it, that would have meant the loss of everything we have on those satellites, which means GPS, which, to really bring that home, especially to students, would mean no more Uber Eats. You got to think about that. It means no more missile guidance. It means really handicapping one's ability to function on Earth. And so if that's what's happening in the current conflict, and we've seen many examples of subsea and internet-related, space satellite-related cuts, if that's where we are, how are we going to have a productive conversation about sharing space? I will go further and say that it probably would be worth looking at the model behind Antarctica to see if that can be extrapolated into space, to say that space is, reiterate that it should be a non-weaponized commons. There should be rules of the road. Already we have so much material in space, and I mean both actual objects that we've placed there, from tiny little satellites the size of a shoebox all the way to these massive 5,000 pound satellites in the International Space Station. But we also now have an incredible amount of space debris, and that space debris is partly from satellites being blown up to create it, but partly also just satellites go into orbit and then they just come to the end of their life and we have no means of retrieving them. And so they just float around. But they don't just float around, they're racing around at 18, 20,000 miles an hour. And a tiny little shard can really destroy something that gets in its path. We've seen the International Space Station almost evacuated a couple of times because of this, what they call the Kessler effect, which some people describe as razor blades in a washing machine. That's what we've already created in space. And that is why NASA is commissioning a huge number of startups with a very large amount of money to go figure out how do we clean all that up. And by the way, that will lead to the use of that discarded debris material to repair and construct in orbit and on the lunar surface as well, right? So the circular economy is coming to space. But I think the key thing is that we don't really have any agreed rules. At this point, China considers American satellites to be, quote, debris, right? That gives you an idea of kind of where we are. So when I say we really need to think through this commons, it's not just what should the commons look like, but how the heck are we all going to agree in an environment where we're pretty contentious here on Earth?
I would add one more point, again, more at the operational level. When we look at supply chains, supply chain platforms where we have collections of companies working together, blockchain as an example. But to build on Pippa's point around the accumulation of junk in low Earth orbit. So we're going to need to get much better at space traffic management, at situational awareness, and that is going to require the cooperation, some sort of platform where we are working together to solve a collective problem. So I absolutely share the concerns that Pippa has raised. I also think some of these more focal problems, just the incentives, will hopefully align the interests of corporations and governments if we're going to unlock space.
It's a fascinating point in terms of kind of there's different ways in which the regime of the commons could be managed. And I think, Pippa's points we're thinking of, depending on the norms or value we're going to have around exchange around the commons, can have a whole plethora of different regimes. Is it going to be a fight to get as much as you want? Because almost like the way political scientists think of a security dilemma, if I can't trust who I'm working with, then I'll just keep sucking as much as possible because I know no one else is. Or interesting enough, Ben, the point you brought up was, if you think of blockchain, where you're making ledgers distributed to kind of everyone, it's almost like the commons is the mechanism of accountability as opposed to the end. It's in terms of everybody has. So if we can make the commons an incentivized way of being accountable and that everyone benefits by having this kind of facilitated transactions another way. So we've been talking about kind of the norms or values of exchange. And if there's more you want to add to that, please do once we get to it. But I wanted to touch on Daniel's point from Clone, and one we saw from the LinkedIn users, that we've been talking about the imagery of the commons. Now I think we're shifting a little bit, some of the audience thinking about, well, what about, so we talk about the picture, let's say, as commons. What about the painters and the paints, let's say? And I think one asks, well, do we need some kind of grand orchestrator like a UN facilitating major space projects, kind of a single painter or a set of painters to do it? Or is it maybe the mechanism of how we do it in terms of CERN, which is the kind of way we talk of international collaboration, where the incentive, the excitement of navigating the frontier can help people think about, well, I need to collaborate with others because we don't have all the assets in one place. So I guess if we stretch this commons further, do we need some internationally accepted kind of arbitrator, convener, grand painter, if you will? Or is there different ways we can get people excited about the paints and subsequently, let's say, the picture that's being built, which is CERN and these kind of collaborative mechanisms? And we can talk about also the other ones in tandem with that. Because how is this going to be governed, or the mechanisms of the governance, if you will, around these commons?
Daniel, I think this is really wonderful question. And in the work I've been doing, I've spent some time with people who come from indigenous backgrounds around the world, from Aborigines in Australia to the Achuar tribe in the Amazon, American Indians of various kinds. And fundamentally, that has been because these people have our oldest stories of our relationship with the stars. And it's very interesting how they think about this moment in history. And remember, for them, and frankly, for most of humanity, even the most hard-nosed, hard-hearted person has a sense that the moon is a sacred space. And so as we reach to touch that surface, again, we have to think about that, especially because when you touch the lunar surface, it's a permanent indelible mark. It's never going to move, right? Every footprint that has happened on the moon is still there. And so now we're going to begin construction, like real construction. And so it's a very interesting cultural question for humanity. And remember, like I said earlier at the beginning, we're not just going to the moon to stay there and to build there. We're going there to build launch pads to go further into space because there's no gravity there, right? So it's much cheaper to launch from there than it is from Earth. And so this is a springboard into the furthest reaches of the galaxy. And now we have the James Webb Telescope. I can't remember how far away it is now, but it's extraordinary distances. And this is where humanity is. Our reach into the depths of space is so far beyond our capacity to understand the kind of meaning of it. It's like a child who can throw a baseball and break a glass window, but doesn't really understand how that happened. And so, in a way, humanity needs to grow up real fast, right? Like we really need to think through all of these aspects, which is why space is so exciting. It offers us not just the possibility of abundance and solving so many of our earthbound problems with space-based solutions, which itself would be an extraordinary leap for humankind. But it also requires us to think through, what does it mean to be human? And how should we treat our fellow humans, especially now that we're going to be in domains where there's no rules.
Thanks, Pippa. I would add a few quick other points. Whether it's the UN or some other institution, I think having that architect, the master painter, the grand painter who can lay out some of the rules of the game. So things like, if we look at the investment that's going to be required, the investment timelines for private equity firms like Sequoia and Future Fund, who are investing in this space already, are not going to match the return and the amount of time we need to see a return. So an institution that can support investment that reflects the probably multi-decade timeline that's going to be required. An institution that can help set the standards. So I said earlier about how we need to make space boring. Well, in order to do that, we need commonality, we need standardization. We need to, for example, we need to have docking mechanisms that are interoperable across different platforms. So having some way of creating standards, of promoting investment, of changing the time horizon so there's certainty to that investment will be important. The other bit that I would just add is I think whoever this grand painter is, we also don't want them to dictate the way in which space, the technologies and the approach to space. I think part of what we know from innovation ecosystems is the value of having variation in how these problems are addressed. And so providing certainty, but still allowing variation in how we approach these challenges is also going to be really important.
Now, this is brilliant in the sense of, and I think we're coming close to time, but I wanted to summarize at least a bit there. This is fascinating in terms of maybe in order to go forward, we need to look back, and the notion of some really deeply indigenous models of governance, of how we think of the commons. Perhaps if there's still the tone setting of the commons is there's so much potential of the space being a common, but it's also sacred. And so we have to deal with it with care. We have to coordinate with care. And there's interesting precedents from that, and which we haven't discussed, but would be quite interesting in terms of kind of thinking about the important role actually of the global South in this process. So there's quite a few space organizations in the Middle East, in Africa, as well as others that have been really starting to advance. And in fact, if you think of some of the different indigenous customary forms of international regimes, the notion of customary institutions as an international regime, I mean, this came out of Tanzania and other kinds of areas where these were kind of common. Truth and reconciliation commissions after conflict, how do you reconcile? I mean, a lot of these pioneering effects came out of places like Rwanda and the like. And I think what was interesting on the other end, what you brought, Ben, was, even if we have a grand architect, or let's say some have mentioned CERN, which was a more kind of distributed kind of governance, you want to have the certainty, you want to lay some certain rules and standards, but not to the point where it cripples any variety. I mean, the idea is that we're not going to know fully one way to do this. And so I guess we have 5 minutes, so I would think maybe we go ahead and start trying to close. And I will add, maybe Ben, in your closing, one thing that I think you touched on, but maybe some were asking to double click on, in terms of some key innovations you think are going to be needed for enabling in-orbit manufacturing. And then maybe from that, build in a final word. And then maybe to you, Pippa, if you have a final word or takeaway you want to give, and then I'll close it out and we'll adjourn for what was really an engaging evening.
Okay. Right. So some of the innovations that are going to be required. So I think the key initiatives that are going to unlock this is the what we call the OSAM and ISAM, the either on-orbit servicing, assembly, and manufacturing, or ISAM, which is the in-space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. So this is essentially creating vehicles, or you might even think of them as space tugs that can inspect, dock, refuel, and make that physical infrastructure of in-space supply chains work. And to make that happen, back to Pippa's original points, is the advances around robotics and artificial intelligence and digitalization more broadly. So I think for me, it's a plethora of technologies that are going to have to be developed that will move us from a Earth-based supply chain to an in-space supply chain. And that's what we're going to need to do to unlock that value. But in order to do that, multiple technologies that need to be integrated, and this is going to take, a lot of time. But I think for me, that's the bit, the ISAM and the INSAM, that will unlock the physical infrastructure of space, so that we are pushing out the frontier of exploration.
And any final takeaways, Ben, you wanted to give before we hand over to Pippa, or that's your takeaway, like the innovation we need?
I think the innovation, yes. I think the thing that I find fascinating is we've got to move away from the Earth-based supply chains, and we've got to integrate it with the in-space supply chain. That's how we're going to unlock the solar-based power and the moon mining, asteroid mining, etc.
Thanks.
Yeah, I so totally agree with that. Even things like nuclear fusion, we need to go to the moon because it has such a huge supply of helium-3, which we'll need for that, right? So everything really benefits from this reach into space. Like I said, we will solve so many earthbound problems with space-based solutions. But I think it's also worth thinking about, because you mentioned, the BRICS, emerging markets, the global South. It's by no means obvious that it's only a superpower that's going to get to the moon or into space first. For example, Rwanda is pursuing something called the Cinnamon 937, which is it will be the largest constellation of satellites. Something like 337,000 of them. Now, only one has gone up, but the permissions for them to do that are in place. And will they be working with China? Who will they be working with? We see the Japanese with their lunar lander. We see Turkey becoming a space power. India is racing to also get its foothold on the lunar surface. So who will be the one that gets there first and can start dictating how the game will be played? It may be the US or China, but it may not. Either way, I do think that a takeaway for the audience is, even once you process that we can solve a lot of earthbound problems with space-based solutions, you may feel that this is still distant from you. And I would say, as an economist, I see an extraordinary number of jobs and work being created by the space economy, and no one will have to go into space, or a few astronauts, but not many. Space is not hospitable to human beings, but it's very hospitable to robotics, automation, remote control, and AI-led systems. So imagine sitting on a hammock somewhere in a beautiful location on a laptop and operating manufacturing facilities that are in orbit, because I think that is the future. And this is the way to think about the space economy. It is something that everyone can be involved with. It's just a very different way of thinking about what the world economy is.
Thank you so much, Pippa and Ben. I will leave with just kind of three questions, I think, synthesizing from this, and then we'll head very quickly. With the space economy, I think a question is the bottleneck shifting? Is it about the application technologies or the technologies needed upstream, the logistics, even the values of exchange, the way in which we're going to exchange information and the like? Is the bottleneck shifting? It's an open question. I think the second one is, what's the international regime that will do this? Is it going to be one that's based on a grand architect painter? Is it going to be a distributed collaborative? Is it going to be someone who has the patience for the long run for this? Is it going to be conflict ridden? Is it going to be collaborative? What is that going to look like? Is it going to be a new player, a new set of groups from the global south? Is it going to be the global north? And then finally, as we always say, do we need to have something new, or do we need to look back to look forward? What kind of indigenous models are there? What kind of prevailing models could help us get there? And then finally, what I think is a summary from a major programs perspective is, which I thought fascinating, is how is this distributedness going to shape and form? Is it going to balloon in certain places, shrink in others? And who's going to decide that as a collaborative? How is that distributed nature going to be? And with that, it's my pleasure, well, actually my sadness, to adjourn this wonderful evening of kind of really a wide variety of topics on space economy. Ben, thank you so much. Pippa, thank you so much. Your knowledge really enriched this, and I look forward to hearing more from the audience and going forward. Thank you all so much for joining in, and take care. Have a good evening, good morning, good afternoon.
Thank you.